Well, thanks to Donald Trump, Greenland is still in the news. Denmark is still in the news. Of course, people there pretty nervous about what happens next, but also actually a bit playful. Um, Danes have decided to launch a petition which is calling for Denmark to buy California, kind of giving Trump a taste of his own medicine, except this one is pretty tongue in cheek and not likely to happen. But by gum, these guys are having fun with it. They're suggesting that California could be renamed New Denmark. They're saying that Denmark needs more sunshine, palm trees, and roller skates. So, kind of buying California would make sense for them. They're saying they could bring a lot actually to California. They could bring hygge, the cuddly thing, to California and to American politics. And they're saying that they could rename Disneyland Hans Christian Andersen Land. They could bring negotiators over from Lego and the cast of Borgen to do the deal with Donald Trump. And they say what they could bring California, here it is: the rule of law, universal health care, and fact based politics. It's not a bad deal, but it's not serious. Meanwhile, back in the serious world, Greenland and Denmark and what Trump wants to do about all of that is still a very live issue. And it casts a bit of a perspective on the past because actually, America, Denmark, Greenland, this has form. In the 1960s, the Americans began to develop a camp in Greenland with permission of the Danes called Camp Century. It was a military base. It was actually developing an underground facility in which a nuclear reactor was housed. It then went on to have secret plans to develop that still further to expand a network of tunnels in which up to 600 nuclear warheads could be stored in an area that would be about 3 times the size of Denmark. Now, you're asking yourself, is this fact or fiction? It sounds very much like science fiction. But that's why I got in touch with a man who knows all about this, because Christian Nielsen was co-author of a book that looked entirely at this whole history of Camp Century and Project Iceworm, which was the other ambitious project. He is an associate professor at Aarhus University in Denmark, and the history of science and how it's played out in Greenland, that's his field. So I started off by just asking him, doesn't this absolutely sound like something out of a science fiction book?
It's quite true. The Camp Century was not a secret base, as you mentioned, because it was actually made quite public because the U.S. Army and the U.S. government, I guess, also wanted to show that they were doing everything they could to sort of to have military activities in Greenland and also to kind of secure Greenland as a fortress against Soviet aggression. What was secret, though, was the bigger plans behind Camp Century, as you mentioned, the plan to have an extended networks of tunnels under the ice, and in these tunnels to have railroad tracks that could transport up to 600 nuclear armed missiles under the ice and then fire them from different fire ranges towards the Soviet Union in case of a military nuclear attack from the Soviets.
And that second part, which is pretty jaw-dropping, that's Project Iceworm.
Exactly, that was known under the code word Project Iceworm, and it was not so when Camp Century was built in the 19 late 1950s, early 1960s, nobody knew about Project Iceworm. That was kept a secret, as you say, and it only appeared when Danish historians in the 1990s came across a document in the US archives that discussed Project Iceworm. And then people realized, okay, there were these plans and they were taking seriously enough to have a discussion in the US Defense Ministry about the scope and the realization of Project Iceworm.
Just move back one then to Camp Century, which was the first, if you like, legit bit of US action. I mean, that arose really because in the Second World War, the Americans had sort of been given the okay by the exiled Danes, since Nazi Germany occupied Denmark, to act as a kind of protector for Greenland, which is Danish territory.
Denmark wanted to reinstate its sovereignty over Greenland. In fact, the US tried to buy Greenland from Denmark just after World War II in 1946. They came with an offer of 100 million US dollars in gold, but the Danish government declined and said, "Okay, we want to keep the sovereignty over Greenland." And then the US or the negotiations ensued that led to the defense agreement over Greenland between the US and Denmark. It was under the auspices of what later became NATO. And in this agreement, the Americans were allowed to have military bases in Greenland. And the first base they built was Thule Air Base in northwestern Greenland. So that's a very large air base, and it was there to allow the US to have very large bomb planes that could fly to the Soviet Union. And essentially, they were interested in finding out how do you operate militarily on ice and into the ice, because that was basically unknown territory, so to speak. I mean, not very much was known about ice surfaces and also the special atmospheric circumstances made communications in the Arctic very difficult. So this is so in the 1950s, they began to have very small bases where they tried out this under the ice concept, as they call it, or below surface concept. And they essentially began to dig out these smaller tunnels and see if they could sustain or be sustainable enough to have equipment and also smaller housing inside these tunnels. And when they found out during the 1950s from these various experiments that this was actually feasible, then they came up with the plan for Camp Century. 300 or 500 meters long tunnels under the ice that could house up to 200 people all year round. And then in addition to that, there was also the US Army nuclear reactor program at the time where they tested out these smaller modular nuclear reactors. And this sounds even more incredible because they then planned to have a nuclear reactor in Camp Century, so buried in tunnels under the ice. And the idea, of course, it seemed it's very logical in some ways because a nuclear reactor would require less fuel and it would be more efficient in supplying the heat and electricity needed for this undersurface military base.
So did they actually go ahead and put a nuclear reactor into Camp Century with people living down there?
Yes. And it was sort of in a separate tunnel in Camp Century, separate from, of course, where the men lived and where all the work facilities and everything was. But it was, let's say, close enough that I guess you and I would not have felt comfortable being so close to a small nuclear reactor. But of course, people at the time they knew less about nuclear power and radioactivity. And we know now, as part of our research, we've documented that there was a leakage when they initiated production and a leakage of radioactivity. And of course, I mean, it would have been quite scary to be in the camp, but as far as we know, the people there, they seemed relatively confident that this was not going to hurt them.
And then what did actually happen? Because, I mean, here's this huge plan. As I understand it, the amount of excavation they were thinking about doing to go further than Camp Century with this Project Iceworm was something extraordinary, like 52,000 miles of tunnel, which is apparently 3 times the size of Denmark, just to put this into scale. Why did they not go ahead with it?
Yeah, there were several reasons for why Project Iceworm never materialized. I think one of the reasons, main reason was perhaps money, because when the US government made an assessment of Project Iceworm, they were trying to figure out how much money to spend on nuclear missile programs. And there were already two missile programs on the way, one with the Navy and one with the US Air Force. So they thought, okay, should we spend money on a third program with the US Army? And I think this was part of the reason that they thought, okay, we don't need three different types of nuclear missile programs. The other reason was also lessons learned at Camp Centric, because they essentially found out that the ice is much more dynamic or even fluid than they had realized when they began Camp Century. Because they knew very well that the ice sort of slowly flows from the middle of Greenland towards the oceans on both sides, but they didn't know exactly how much this flow would affect the stability of the tunnels, and they also didn't know. And what happened was, in fact, that when you have people and you have machines and you have heating systems and you have a nuclear reactor and everything else in these tunnels, then the heat that is generated there makes the ice much more dynamic and fluid, and this means that essentially the tunnels were all the time kind of collapsing in on the people in there. So they had to spend a lot of time doing maintenance on these tunnels. So that's another reason why they came to the conclusion that this is not a viable plan. And thirdly, there was also resistance from the Danish government, because even though Denmark allowed Camp Century to be built, and they also accommodated the wishes of the American government to have nuclear weapons at Thule Air Base, although this was being done in secret, there was a bit of a reluctance on the Danish government on behalf of all things nuclear in Greenland.
And it seems an irony now that Greenland is a pretty much autonomous territory with quite a lot of control, that there's no mention of the Greenlanders in that equation at all, because there wasn't really. But what about that radioactive ice and snow? I mean, who cleared that up, and is it still a radioactive environment?
Some of the radioactivity was cleared up, so they removed the reactor core and all of the radioactive equipment from Camp Century when they closed down the camp in the late 60s. But they left a lot of radioactive wastewater in terms of coolant that was discharged into the ice with the permission of the Danish government. So this is a kind of low radioactive wastewater from the nuclear power production, and this is still sort of embedded into the ice. And when they left it there, they thought, okay, this is going to be there for eternity, right? We don't have to bother about it because the ice is so stable that it will simply just be kept there. But of course, we know now with the climate change and so on that perhaps the ice is melting at a faster rate than expected. And in fact, I think now these scientists have changed their expectations a little bit and say, well, maybe the area is more, the ice there is more stable than we originally thought, and at least now, as far as I know, they can't see it in their climate models until 100 years into the future. So we still have a little time, let's say.
But those Greenlanders who helped excavate, initially, I mean, some of them did contract cancer, didn't they?
No, that's another story. That's a story that is connected to the accident at Thule Air Base in 1968, where a U.S. nuclear bomber, how do you say, it fell down on the ice. There was an accident, and it had on board 4 nuclear hydrogen bombs, and there was kind of a cleanup action that took place after this, and this is where a lot of a lot of local workers were involved, and they long after they at least they claimed to have contracted cancer from this cleanup operation.
And in a way, where's the outrage? Because this is just outrageous, isn't it?
At the time, there was no such outrage. I mean, it was, as I mentioned, Camp Century was made public in many ways. Journalists came to Camp Century to talk about it. There was a Danish Boy Scout who was invited to spend the winter at Camp Century together with an American Boy Scout. The two young men lived with the men in Camp Century and saw what it's like. And they sent back travel diaries and so on that was published in newspapers. So at the time, this was not seen as something as extraordinary, I guess. But when you look at it from a point of view of today, of course, it plays into the, let's say, post-colonial history of Greenland, right? Because at the time, no Greenlanders were asked about this. This was purely a matter that was solved between Copenhagen and Washington. And yeah, the decisions, it never dawned on anybody at the time to make this a decision, a joint decision between Denmark and Greenland. Or mainly, I think, because Denmark still had a kind of a colonial view on Greenland, right? That we knew what was in the best interests of the Greenlanders, and therefore it seemed right that the Danish, and we also knew about the foreign diplomatic issues that were at stake, and these were very high issues because we are in the midst of a Cold War with a potential nuclear war, looming over our heads, and Denmark was also being threatened by the Soviet Union if we allowed the Americans too much space in Greenland. So it is really a high tension issue that plays out in this post-colonial context as well.
But of course, this has now got the added interest of Donald Trump wanting to buy Greenland, having that aggressive phone call with your Prime Minister, and still, although, let's face it, he has moved on to want to buy other things, still seems to have Greenland in his sights. Denmark and Greenland have said it's not for sale. But it kind of colours it looks like an extraordinary bid to the average bystander. But clearly the Americans have got history now with being able to do essentially what they wanted on Greenland.
I think right now it plays into the sort of the national discussion in Greenland about because there's election coming up on March 11th, and I think the main topic of this election is going to be independence, and so this is a potentially very delicate or even threatening situation for Denmark, Greenland, and Greenland as well, perhaps Greenland in particular, because if Greenland moves ahead with its independence, I think it will become very vulnerable to U.S. interests, and it's certainly the case that the USA is not able to buy Greenland. I think that discussion, as our Prime Minister once said, is an absurd discussion, but it also shows that the US will never allow an fully independent Greenland, because Greenland is simply too vulnerable. It doesn't have its own defense, and there's so many things that hinders Greenland from being an independent nation, and the Americans will never allow it. So they will kind of in some ways take over Greenland, and I think this will be problematic, to say the least, for the Greenlanders.
Although I suppose you could have thought the same would happen about Iceland. And actually there's a big fuss when the Americans finally left Keflavik Air Base. There was a fuss when they came and there was a fuss when they left. But I mean, Iceland has survived with and without the Americans.
No, you're right. You're right. I think, and I don't know all the details about the Icelandic history and the reasons why they succeeded in gaining independence and what happened in the immediate after. I think the big difference is, of course, the size of the land, right? So Greenland is just an enormous piece of land, and the population there lives in very scattered cities, mainly on the west coast, southern west coast of Greenland. So it's impossible for anyone in Greenland to kind of regulate what's going on in Greenland. It's possible for almost any nation. Also very difficult to Denmark to assist in this. So,
But could an independent Greenland not join NATO the same way Iceland joined NATO?
yes, it could. It could, and it could also make to strengthen or to have a new defense agreement with the Americans. I think that would certainly be required if Denmark, also if Greenland decided to become independent. But again, I think that would also, they would be hard pressed to make any, let's say, demands on how that agreement should look like, and it would be kind of enforced by the US. But so it's a delicate situation, and
then I suppose that the worry is, as we would say, if you give an inch, they take a mile. I mean, that's what basically happened last time around with Camp Century, which was agreed, and then this other project, which would have been huge, that wasn't agreed. Surely that must still sit there in people's now, especially that you've excavated all that history with your book. It must be a bit of a warning as to what would happen with an American presence.
No, I think it is a bit of a warning, and I think also what happened the last time. So when the U.S. Last time tried to buy Greenland in 1946, even though Denmark declined, I mean, the story afterwards with the defense agreement with Thule Air Base and Camp Century and so on clearly shows that there's nothing really we can do.
And so, just finally, I appreciate you. You're a calm man. You're a Danish man. You're not as prone to kind of the tabloid headlines as we are over here. But do people not feel a sense of just alarm and some outrage at what's just happened with Trump basically trying to buy part of your territory or potentially an independent Greenland, when all inhabitants are saying no thank you, because we're outraged over here and we're not even Danes?
Yeah, no, I may also be an exceptionally calm person for a Dane, because I know a lot of my friends are perhaps even more outraged than I am. But no, you're right. There is an outrage here over how Donald Trump and his administration, deals with this issue, and also not only the statements, but also, the fact that when his son went to Greenland to try to, make convince the Greenlanders that they should just switch over to the US and so on. I think that people are outraged. Yes, you're right. But when that being said, I think we're also very pragmatic in understanding that, okay, we cannot, because we cannot try to speak against the Americans. I think people are also outraged because, Denmark has been, in the past 20 years or so, we've been sort of a stern advocate of US foreign policies, right? And we've agreed to enter into different wars with the US and so supported the US essentially in their very, some would call it aggressive foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Denmark has been support of that, right? And now we are not. We're just being kind of the Americans trying to run us over in some ways.
Right. Well, we'll see what happens on the elections on March the 11th. But meantime, thank you so much for that. The link to the book is in the comments and the notes beneath this in the YouTube posting. And thank you so much, Christian. Well, if you want to see more about the Nordics and another film about Greenland, do have a look in my YouTube channel. There's a feature-length film about Denmark itself and another about Estonia. If you like and subscribe, any new material will wing its way straight to you. As for me, I'm a bit of a Nordic fan. I've set up a group called Nordic Horizons, which has been taking speakers over from the Nordic countries to the Scottish Parliament for the last 12 years. We've had 70 speakers over. I've made films about them. I've done a PhD comparing Norway and Scotland and kind of learnt a little bit of Norwegian along the way. So there's plenty of material. There's a podcast, there's articles. I'm a journalist. and other films, just have a look on the website, which is leslieriddick.com. But anyway, thanks for watching this. I hope you like the YouTube channel, and I'll see you soon.